my dear traveller, you've returned to the warmth of my hearth once more. Tonight, I find myself thinking of walls, of stone and mortar, yes, but also of the walls we build in our hearts when the world grows dark around us. I'm reminded of a time, perhaps 4 centuries past, when I learned that sometimes the greatest magic is not in spells or enchantments, but in the simple act of holding together when everything seeks to tear apart. It was during the siege of Harrowhall Castle, a fortress I came to know too well during the longest winter of my life, a time when hunger taught lessons that no tome ever could, when a baker's ingenuity mattered more than all my arcane knowledge, and when a boy became a man in the space between heartbeats. So draw that blanket close, dear friend, for this is a tale of endurance, of what people become when the world outside grows teeth, and of how sometimes the walls that imprison us also protect us. Let me tell you of Harrowhall, where I learned that survival is the oldest magic of all. I came to Harrowhall Castle in the early days of autumn, summoned by Lord Alric Drakemore, an aging but proud noble who had heard whispers of war gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The castle stood sentinel over the Thorndale Valley, a fortress of black stone that had watched over the lands for 300 years. Harrowhall was impressive in the way that only old castles can be. Not pretty, you understand, but solid, uncompromising. Its walls rose from the living rock like something grown rather than built, and its towers watched the valley approaches with the patient eyes of something that had seen empires rise and fall. When I first rode through those gates, the castle was alive with preparation. The market courtyard, usually bustling with merchants from the valley below, now echoed with the sound of blacksmiths working overtime. Arrows by the thousands, spearheads being hammered straight, armor being mended and oiled. Lord Alric met me in the great hall, a man in his 60th year with iron-grey hair and hands that still showed the calluses of a knight who had risen through the ranks. His banner hung behind the high table, a silver drake on a field of midnight blue, though the fabric was frayed from years of wind and weather. "Master Wizard," he said, clasping my hand with the firm grip of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I thank you for answering my call. Dark tidings come from the east. Lord Morwyn of Blackthorn has raised his banners against us." The feud between Drakemore and Blackthorn was old, older than Lord Alric himself. Something about a broken betrothal, lands seized during a hard winter, the sort of grievances that fester like wounds that never properly heal. But what mattered now was that Morwyn commanded 3,000 men, while Harrowhall could muster perhaps 800, including the farmers who had never held anything sharper than a scythe. I spent those first days helping where I could, strengthening the ancient wards that protected the castle's water supply, teaching the guards how to recognize the signs of magical assault. But mostly, I watched as people who had never expected war prepared for something they couldn't truly imagine. There was a guard, Thomas, I think his name was, who pulled me aside one evening as I walked the walls. He was a simple man, the sort who spent his days checking gates and making sure the torches stayed lit. But his eyes held a strange worry when he spoke to me. "Master Wizard," he said, glancing around as if the stones themselves might be listening, "I've been having the strangest dreams, the same dream, night after night. I see our gates, the great oak and iron gates that have never fallen. I see them standing wide open, no battle, no breaking, they just open like they want to let the enemy in." I told him that dreams born of worry rarely come to pass, but his words stayed with me. In my experience, when simple folk start having prophetic dreams, it's wise to listen. The last of the valley's people arrived 3 days before the enemy. Farmers with wagons piled high with what they could carry, shepherds driving their flocks up the winding path to the castle, families clutching children who didn't understand why they couldn't go home. The castle's population swelled from 300 to nearly 2,000 souls, all looking to those black stone walls for protection. I remember standing on the battlements that final evening, watching the last of the harvest fires burning in the abandoned fields below. Tomorrow those fields would be trampled by enemy boots, but tonight they still belonged to the people of Thorndale. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of marching drums. They came with the dawn mist, not in a great charge or with battle cries echoing off the valley walls, but quietly, methodically, like a tide that rises so slowly you don't notice until the water is around your ankles. I watched from the highest tower as they spread across the valley floor, 3,000 men moving with the precision of a military machine. They didn't rush toward our walls, didn't waste themselves in futile assaults. Instead, they simply surrounded us, ring after ring of pavilions and cooking fires, picket lines for horses, earthworks and palisades. By evening, we were an island of stone in a sea of enemy torches. The sight was strangely beautiful in a terrible way, like looking up at stars, except these stars meant death and conquest. Inside the castle, the mood was tense but not yet desperate. Lord Alric had called all the able-bodied men to the great hall, farmers and craftsmen standing shoulder to shoulder with knights who had trained for war since childhood. The contrast was striking. Hands that were better suited to holding ploughs now gripped sword hilts. Eyes that knew the patterns of seasons now studied the faces of professional soldiers. There was a young man, Edwin, barely 18 summers, who stood in the front rank despite being nothing more than a squire. His master, Sir Garrett, had fallen ill with lung fever, leaving Edwin to carry arms he'd only ever polished, to wear armor that still bore the dents from his master's last campaign. "My lord," Edwin said when Alric asked for volunteers to man the outer walls, "I may be young, but I have good eyes and a steady hand. Give me a bow, and I'll make every arrow count." Lord Alric looked at this boy, this child playing at being a soldier, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not pity, but recognition. The recognition of someone who remembered what it felt like to be young and untested, facing something larger than yourself. "Very well, Edwin Cartwright," he said formally, but you'll serve under Sergeant Mills, and you'll follow orders without question. This is not a tourney, and there are no second chances. That night, as I walked the walls making my final preparations, I found Edwin at his post, staring out at the enemy fires with wide eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide fear. "Have you ever been in a siege, Master Wizard?" he asked me, his voice trying for nonchalance and not quite succeeding. "A few," I admitted. "More than I'd prefer. Fewer than some." Meanwhile, the castle's steward was conducting the first of what would become daily inventories. Grain stores, salt pork, dried fish, every scrap of food that stood between 2,000 people and starvation. The numbers were troubling. Even with careful rationing, the food would last perhaps 6 weeks. 7 if people were willing to accept being constantly hungry. Less than that if the siege dragged into winter when bodies needed more fuel to fight the cold. But in those first days, when the walls still felt strong and the enemy still seemed distant, 6 weeks felt like an eternity. People settled into routines. Children found ways to play in the courtyards. The baker continued baking bread, though the loaves grew smaller each day. It was peaceful in a strange way, like being in the eye of a storm, where the wind stops howling and everything goes deadly still. The first week passed quietly. Enemy and defender watching each other across the morning mist like players in some elaborate game. Then the second week, and the third. The bread rations were cut, and cut again. The smell of cooking that once filled the castle's courtyards grew thinner, more desperate. There was a baker's apprentice, a girl named Sarah, who came to him with an idea born of pure desperation. "Master Baker," she said, "what if we ground acorns with the flour? My grandmother did it during the famine year, said it stretched the bread and filled bellies just as well." The head baker, a traditional man set in his ways, was skeptical. But when you're watching children grow thin and hollow-eyed, when mothers ask you quietly if there will be bread tomorrow, you listen to any idea that might help. Sarah spent 3 days experimenting, grinding acorns, leaching out the bitterness, mixing different ratios with the dwindling flour. The bread that resulted was, well, it was dense and dark and tasted of the forest, but it was bread. And it meant that children could sleep without their stomachs cramping from hunger. I found myself spending more and more time with the children during those long days, not because I had nothing else to do. There was always some magical preparation to make, some ward to strengthen, but because children have a way of cutting through the fear and uncertainty that adults wrap around themselves like armor. They would gather around me in the evenings, when the day's work was done and families huddled together in whatever space they could find, and I would tell them stories, tales of distant lands where the sun always shone, of dragons who were friends rather than enemies, of heroes who always found a way to save the day. The steward, in his methodical way, had been taking inventory of every storeroom, every cellar, every space that might hold forgotten supplies. He was in the castle's deepest foundation, a series of chambers carved from the living rock, when he noticed something odd about one of the walls. The stones were different, older, more weathered. When pressed, they shifted slightly, and behind them was a passage that none of the castle's records mentioned. Lord Alric called for me immediately, and together we explored what turned out to be a tunnel that led outside the castle walls. Unfortunately, it ended at a dry well some 200 yards from the nearest gate, within easy sight of the enemy sentries. Useless for escape, Lord Alric muttered as we climbed back up to the castle proper. But perhaps we could use it to send messages. If someone could reach the well unseen, if they were small and quick. We both looked at each other with the same thought. A child could make that journey, could slip through shadows where a grown man would be spotted instantly. But asking a child to risk their life, even to save everyone else? The decision was tabled, but the tunnel remained. A secret that might become salvation, or might become just another way to die. 5 weeks into the siege, with winter beginning to bite and the bread rations cut to portions that barely kept body and soul together, we discovered that fear had found its way inside our walls. It was Edwin who spotted him, one of the men-at-arms trying to slip out through a postern gate in the dead of night. Not to fight, not to scout, but to surrender, to walk across to the enemy lines and beg for mercy in exchange for information about our defenses. The man's name was Willem, a soldier who had served House Drakemore for 15 years, a steady, reliable man who had never given anyone cause to doubt his loyalty. But 5 weeks of watching children grow thin, 5 weeks of listening to his own stomach growl, 5 weeks of wondering if the sun would ever rise on better days, had worn away at his courage until fear was all that remained. When they brought Willem before Lord Alric, the hall fell silent in a way that seemed to press against the stones themselves. Everyone understood what this meant, what the punishment would be. Desertion during siege was death, had always been death. No exceptions, no mercy. But as Lord Alric reached for his sword, as the knights stepped forward to carry out the sentence, I found myself speaking words I hadn't planned to say. "My lord," I said, my voice carrying in the stillness, "might I suggest that fear is not the same as treason? This man has served you faithfully for 15 years. Surely that counts for something." Lord Alric's hand stopped on his sword hilt. Around the hall, I could see faces turning toward me, some grateful, others shocked that I would intervene in military justice. "He would have told them everything," Lord Alric said quietly. "Our numbers, our supplies, the location of every weakness in our walls. He would have bought his life with ours." "Perhaps," I agreed, "or perhaps he would have told them nothing of value, and they would have killed him anyway once they learned how little he actually knew. The enemy doesn't spare cowards, my lord. They use them and discard them." I stepped forward, looking Willem in the eyes, seeing a man who had let desperation override honor, but who was still at his core the same person who had served faithfully for so many years. "Willem," I said gently, You've lived behind these walls for 15 years. You've eaten at Lord Alric's table. You've been paid from his treasury. You've slept safely because of his protection. Do you really believe that Lord Morwyn, a man who would starve innocent children to win a war, would show you more mercy than the Lord you've served all this time? Willem's shoulders began to shake, not with defiance, but with the weight of understanding what he'd almost done. When he looked up, his eyes were wet with tears of shame. "My lord," he whispered, I was so hungry. My children, they look at me like I should be able to fix this, and I can't. I can't even feed them properly. I thought maybe if I surrendered they would feed us. I thought." "You thought," Lord Alric said, his voice gentler than before, like a father instead of a soldier. "There's no shame in that, Willem, but there would have been shame in what came after." Instead of execution, Willem was given a choice. He could leave, walk out through the gates and take his chances with the enemy, or he could stay and prove that his 15 years of service meant something by helping to defend the people he'd tried to abandon. Willem chose to stay, and 3 days later, his decision saved us all. He was on watch duty, manning one of the wall towers that overlooked the valley, when he spotted something that the other guards had missed. Enemy soldiers working in the pre-dawn darkness, not building siege engines or preparing for assault, but digging a tunnel that led directly toward the foundations of our gatehouse. The enemy had learned the same lesson we had, that sometimes the best way through a wall is to go under it. They meant to collapse our gatehouse from below, to bring down the stones that had protected Harrowhall for 3 centuries. Willem's warning gave us time to prepare, to dig our own counter-tunnel, to be ready when they broke through. And when that moment came, when enemy miners found themselves face to face with Harrowhall defenders in the darkness beneath the earth, Willem fought with the desperate courage of a man who had something to prove. The underground battle was brief but vicious. Pick and shovel against sword and spear in a space so narrow that men could barely swing their weapons. But we held them, drove them back, and collapsed their tunnel before they could threaten our walls. That night, as we treated the wounded and counted our dead, Lord Alric found Willem cleaning his borrowed sword with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Thank you," Lord Alric said simply. Willem looked up, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes held something other than fear. "Thank you, my lord," he replied, "for giving me the chance to remember who I am." The enemy's response to the failure of their tunnel was swift and terrible. If they couldn't bring down our walls from below, they would try to burn us out from above. It came in the deep of night, when most of the castle slept and only the watch walked the walls. The first arrow struck the wooden roof of the armory, a cloth-wrapped shaft soaked in pitch and set ablaze, then another and another, until the sky above Harrowhall was filled with falling stars of fire. The alarm bells rang out across the castle, the same bells that had called people to evening prayers, now shrieking warnings of destruction. In moments the courtyards filled with people, some running toward the flames to fight them, others fleeing in panic as sparks rained down like deadly snow. I found myself in the thick of it, not because of any particular bravery, but because fire and magic are old companions. I could call water from the air, could smother flames with words of power, could shield the bucket brigades from the worst of the heat. But even magic has limits, and there were too many fires spreading too quickly. The worst of it was in the stable block, where the hay stores caught like tinder and threatened to spread to the grain storage. If we lost our remaining food, the siege would be over whether the walls held or not. It was there, in that chaos of smoke and flame, that young Edwin proved himself a man. He was leading a group of stable boys, trying to evacuate the horses before the roof came down, when a flaming timber fell directly toward Lord Alric, who had come to assess the damage. Without thinking, without hesitation, Edwin threw himself forward, knocking his lord clear just as the burning wood crashed down where he had been standing. The timber caught Edwin across the shoulder, and I can still remember the smell of singed hair and cloth, the sound of his sharp intake of breath as the pain hit him. But he rolled clear, helped Lord Alric to his feet, and immediately went back to leading the evacuation as if nothing had happened. "Boy," Lord Alric said, catching Edwin's arm as he passed. "That was well done." Edwin paused, looked back at the man whose life he'd just saved, and grinned through the soot and smoke on his face. "Just following orders, my lord. You told me to watch for threats, didn't specify they had to be enemies." But the fire brought more than just danger and heroism. It brought revelation. As the flames spread across the gatehouse, as the ancient oak and iron began to char and smoke, the heat revealed something that had been hidden for generations. Burned into the wood of the gates themselves, invisible until the fire brought it forth like invisible ink, was a sigil. Not the drake of House Drakemore, but the thorn-crowned skull of House Blackthorn. A mark of ownership, or perhaps a mark of betrayal, burned into the very heart of Harrowhall's defenses. Lord Alric stared at that mark as if it were a ghost from his nightmares, and perhaps it was. The feud between Drakemore and Blackthorn went back generations, to a time when the two houses had been allies rather than enemies, when marriages had been arranged, treaties signed, oaths sworn. But oaths like wood can burn, and sometimes the ashes reveal truths that were meant to stay buried. "My grandfather's grandfather," Lord Alric said quietly, as we stood watching the mark smoulder in the dying flames, broke his betrothal to Lord Morwyn's ancestor. The insult was considerable, but I never knew, never suspected that they had marked our gates with their claim. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a war for land or resources. This was vengeance, personal, generational vengeance that had festered for 100 years before finally erupting into open warfare. The fires burned themselves out before dawn, leaving behind smoke-blackened walls and the acrid smell of charred wood. We had saved the grain stores, barely. Most of the horses were safe, though the stables would need rebuilding. And we had learned something about our enemy that changed everything. Lord Morwen of Blackthorn hadn't come to conquer. He had come to collect a debt written in shame and sealed with blood. And such debts are rarely settled with anything less than complete destruction. The storm that broke 3 days after the fire seemed like yet another burden. The enemy camp spread across the valley floor began to disappear beneath rivers of mud. Their siege engines began to sink into ground. Men who had been comfortable in pavilions and tents found themselves bailing water and reinforcing earthworks that dissolved faster than they could be rebuilt. It was during the worst of the storm, when the rain was coming down so hard that you couldn't see the enemy lines even from the highest tower, that Sarah, the baker's apprentice, came to me with an idea that bordered on madness. "Master Wizard," she said, water dripping from her hair as she found me checking the magical wards that protected our water supply, "the tunnel, the one that leads to the old well. In all this rain, in all this mud, a person could crawl out there and not be seen, even if someone was watching." I stared at this slip of a girl, this child who had already saved us once with her ingenuity, and realized what she was proposing. "Sarah," I said carefully, "that well is 200 yards from the walls, 200 yards of open ground in the middle of an enemy army. Even with the storm, even with the darkness, it's almost certainly death." She looked at me with eyes that held far too much determination for someone her age. "Master Wizard," she said quietly, "we're all going to die anyway if this siege doesn't end. At least this way, someone might live to remember us." The message she carried was simple, written on oiled parchment in Lord Alric's own hand, a plea for aid sent to Lord Garrett of Millhaven, a banner-sworn vassal who commanded perhaps 500 men-at-arms. Not enough to break the siege by force, but perhaps enough to tip the balance if they struck at the right moment. I watched from the walls as Sarah slipped out through the tunnel, a shadow moving through shadows in the pre-dawn darkness. The rain swallowed her almost immediately, and for the next 6 hours I stood watch, wondering if I had just helped a brave girl commit suicide. She returned just as the sun was setting, muddy and exhausted and shaking from cold, but alive. The message had been delivered, and Lord Garrett's response was already on its way back with her. 3 days, she gasped as the guards pulled her back through the tunnel. "Lord Garrett says he can be here in 3 days with 400 men. He says to hold fast, because help is coming." 3 days passed like 3 years. But on the morning of the 4th day, we heard them, horns blowing in the distance, not the rough war horns of Blackthorn, but the silver trumpets of Millhaven. And beneath the sound of the horns, the thunder of hoofbeats as 400 cavalry crested the ridge and poured down into the valley like an avalanche of steel and fury. The attack came from the east, from the direction Lord Morwen least expected. His army was spread thin, weakened by weeks of siege warfare and the recent storms, when Lord Garrett's cavalry hit their picket lines, when the surprise was complete and the momentum unstoppable, the entire enemy formation began to collapse like a house of cards. From the walls of Harrowhall we could see everything. The flash of sunlight on armor, the swirl of banners, the desperate scramble as Morwen's forces tried to regroup and respond. Some units held, fought with the grim professionalism of seasoned soldiers, but others broke and ran. And once an army starts running, it's almost impossible to stop. Lord Alric ordered the gates opened, and for the first time in 7 weeks, the men of Harrowhall rode out to battle. Not many, we couldn't spare many, but enough to show that we were still strong, still defiant, still willing to fight for what was ours. Edwin rode with them, no longer a squire, but a knight in everything but name, carrying a sword that had been earned rather than inherited. Willem rode beside him, a man who had found his courage again in the darkness beneath the earth. The battle was brief but decisive. Caught between the hammer of Millhaven's charge and the anvil of Harrowhall's walls, Lord Morwen's army shattered. By sunset, the valley floor was empty, except for abandoned siege engines and the debris of a broken host. Lord Morwen himself escaped, fled with a handful of his household knights toward distant lands where the name Blackthorn might still command respect. But his army was gone, his war was over, and the ancient debt he had come to collect would remain unpaid for another generation. Dawn came clear and cold. The first sunrise in 7 weeks that wasn't filtered through enemy smoke or blocked by hostile banners. From the highest tower of Harrowhall, the valley spread out like a painting. Autumn colors bright beneath clean sky, with only the scars of abandoned earthworks to show that an army had ever been there at all. People emerged from the castle like flowers opening to the sun. Children who had spent weeks in cramped quarters ran laughing through courtyards they had forgotten were safe to play in. Women who had hoarded every scrap of food began planning meals that weren't just about survival. Men who had slept with weapons beside their beds finally set them aside. The celebrations began that very evening. Not wild revelry, but quiet gatherings of people who needed to be near each other, to touch and speak and confirm that they were still alive, still safe, still together. The bread was still made with acorns, but Sarah, the baker's apprentice, had found ways to make even that taste like a feast. Lord Alric held court in the great hall, and it was there, with the whole castle watching, that he formally knighted young Edwin Cartwright, not for his birth or his connections, but for his courage, his quick thinking, and his willingness to put the lives of others before his own. "Rise, Sir Edwin," Lord Alric said as Edwin knelt before the high table. Knight of Harrowhall, defender of the realm and protector of the innocent, may your sword never lose its edge, and may your heart never forget what it means to serve others before yourself. Edwin rose with tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of pure joy. He was 19 years old, barely a man by most reckonings, but he had earned his place among the knights of the realm in the truest way possible. Sarah, too, was honored, not with a knighthood, which would have been impossible for a baker's apprentice, but with something perhaps more valuable. Lord Alric granted her a piece of land, a small farm in the valley where she could build a life for herself, where she would never have to depend on anyone else's grain stores again. "You saved us twice," he told her as he handed her the deed. "Once with your bread, and once with your courage. That deserves more than words." As for Willem, the man who had almost betrayed us all, Lord Alric made a different kind of announcement. Willem would serve as captain of the castle scouts, responsible for watching the roads and ensuring that Harrowhall was never again caught unprepared. It was a position of trust, a chance for a man to rebuild his reputation through faithful service. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Lord Alric said when some questioned the appointment, "and no one will guard against betrayal more vigilantly than someone who knows what it costs." The tunnel that Sarah had used for her dangerous journey was sealed, but not forgotten. A small shrine was built above the old well, a place where people could remember the courage of a baker's apprentice who risked everything to save others. The gates were rebuilt, new oak and iron replacing the charred wood that had borne the mark of ancient shame. But Lord Alric chose not to erase that mark entirely. Instead, he had it carved into a stone tablet and mounted in the great hall with an inscription beneath. "Let this remind us that old wounds left untended can fester into new wars. Better to heal than to seek vengeance. Better to build than to tear down." When spring came to Thorndale Valley, when the first green shoots appeared in the fields that had been trampled by enemy boots, I knew it was time for me to continue my journey. The castle no longer needed an old wizard's protection. My farewell was difficult. These people had become more than just another contract, another noble's commission. They had become family, I suppose. The kind of family that's forged in hardship rather than born in blood. Sarah brought me a loaf of her finest bread for the road, made with real wheat flour, sweet and golden. Edwin, now Sir Edwin, presented me with a dagger he had forged himself. Simple work, but honest, with my initials worked into the cross guard. Lord Alric walked with me to the gates, the new gates that bore no mark of ancient shame. We stood there in the morning sunlight, looking out over the valley where farmers were already back at their ploughs, where children played in meadows that had so recently been battlefields. Harrowhall still stands. I've heard word of it from time to time over the years. The Drakemore line continues, Edwin's descendants among them, for he married well and raised sons who inherited both his courage and his kindness. Sarah's farm prospered, became a place where travelers could find good bread and better stories. The feud with House Blackthorn never truly ended, but it never flared into open war again either. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for. Not the healing of all wounds, but the wisdom to know when enough blood has been shed. And so, my dear friend, that is the tale of the siege of Harrowhall Castle. Sometimes our greatest battles are not fought with sword and spell, but with bread and courage. The fire grows dim now, and these old eyes are heavy with the weight of memory. Outside, the wind has quieted to a whisper, and somewhere in the distance I can hear the sound of church bells marking the late hour. Peaceful sounds, the sounds of a world at rest. Rest well, dear traveller. May your own walls be strong. May your bread be sweet. And may you always find the courage to stand guard over the things and people you hold dear. The siege of winter will end. Spring will come again to every valley. And somewhere, in castles both real and imagined, brave people will always be ready to light a candle against the darkness.